And welcome to the program. Thanks for joining me. The War Force. My guest is Michael Tsarion. He is an Irish author, researcher, and public speaker. Michael, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
It's a great pleasure, Chuck. Thanks for the invitation.
It's my honor. You're also the co-host of Unslaved, and I appreciate your having me on your show as well.
Oh, that was a great day, and I've looked for it for almost half of the year. In summer of last year, I finished all of your 3 books, and I just couldn't wait to get you scheduled in. And actually, I still think of it as one of our best interviews.
Well, thank you. And your books are quite interesting as well. And you really, you cover a broad and vast area of interest, both in terms of religion and the forces that influence religion today, and pre-Christian religion as well in Europe, what we might call indigenous belief systems and cultures, particularly Celtic and Nordic. But also you talk about politics. And I want to talk a little bit about your background, how it is, what shaped you, what helped you arrive at the fascinating position you're in now with the kind of knowledge that you have.
Well, I came out to America several times in the 80s, but I didn't stay, for a long period of time until after 1989. Then I stayed, till now. I mean, it's been almost 20 years from then on. But the formative years in Ireland, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think that would be one of the biggest answers, because I grew up in the Troubles. And so you couldn't, how could you avoid being into politics? It came to your door, it found you out.
Right,
and
right.
Also some intriguing stuff behind the scenes, the people have looked into that. And also then the second thing would be having this rabid Marxist father, who you only needed to be in his, exposed to that rhetoric, particularly Irish kind of Marxism, but I'm sure it was very similar to Cuban or Angolan or Soviet. So in the end of the day, it all comes out in the wash. But to be exposed to their lies, their hypocrisy, and basically their double standards, for 20 odd years or whatever, I became a conservative by default, because you only have to be exposed to that to realize everything they're talking about is wrong. And then finally, when you get into, the Solzhenitsyns and then you find out, oh, wait a minute, there's actually a counterpoint to all of this rhetoric that they're talking about brotherhood of man and freedom for the world and all the other utopian rhetoric they get into while they're murdering and committing genocide. Then you realize, okay, there is a bona fide school of rebuttal to this, And then so I would say that background of having a father like that to espouse the most preposterous anti-human nonsense, anti-spiritual nonsense, we might add, under the name of utopian, George Soros politics. Yeah, and I find it sounds all good, but it obviously didn't sink into me, and I saw the hypocrisy, and so that's made me very, very apprehensive to general liberalism, especially the more extreme radical right, left-wing politics. It made me, I was supposed conservative, not by choice, but almost by default. And then, it just snowballed from that point on. When I arrived back in America in the 90s, I took a more serious interest. But that was the background for sure. And also growing up in London a lot. I'm born in Ireland, grew up in Ireland, but spent a lot of time in London, surrounded by, foreigners, like from, Muslims. And it doesn't mean they're all evil or anything far from that, but it did give me a big exposure as a young child to all these different ethnic groups. So when I speak about them, I can do so with authority,
No, and I would say that my background is somewhat similar in that far left-wing relatives and friends and culture, very left Jewish secular atmosphere. And I've considered my broadcasting and my writing, and you probably feel the same way. It's been a process of debugging myself, deprogramming myself from a lot of stuff that I had assumed was true, that I existed within a fishbowl of ideas. And that's one of the things that I like about doing media. I like interviewing people and writing books. And that was the original intent of the founding fathers of the United States when they codified the First Amendment in the Constitution. They actually they weren't having an amendment of free speech so people could go tell someone else they could go fuck themselves. It was there because they wanted people to explore power and ideas and influences on life, and to identify them and then expose them as the best salve toward maintaining sovereignty and freedom, because they understood that power is corrupting and that government is a necessary evil. You can see a lot of tracts amongst the founders that express that. And that's been the American ethos anyways, that, government is a necessary evil, but it's something that we need to preserve and protect our sovereign God-given rights as citizens, and that rights come from God, and that man is a reflection of God, and that we are, as imperfect beings, we exercise a certain limited grant of sovereignty. And in that context, the government is put in place by us, it's man-made, to preserve and protect that sovereignty. So,
correct. Yeah, and again, the government has not been protecting us. You're right that this was in the minds of the founding fathers, who were very much, I don't think they were that political. I think they were quite, in their own way, spiritual and truly humanitarian. Words we use today that have lost their value. I really did think that they understood the magnificence of the project they were doing, and I think the original experiment was fine. See, I'm of the opinion that the original experiment was probably going to go okay, with pitfalls, but it was going to go okay until the Communist International, what we would refer to today as the Communist International, moved in, and it moved in courtesy of Britain, some secret societies in Britain, but also from Europe as well. In one way or another, through the CFR and different federal orgs, it got ensconced. It got ensconced maybe through the federal banks and so on. And so the experiment started to be nibbled away at, gradually. But the word went out. There was some of my great mentors within the conspiracy movement, people who, like myself, do believe there's a worldwide conspiracy. They were Christians. They kicked this. They had an awareness because they came out of wars. Remember, they came out of Vietnam and even the Second World War, and they weren't happy with what they saw when they came home. They weren't happy with the status quo and the way things were going. So, I read their books. I dived into their books, and anything that I'm writing about now is based on study of the greats, of the older generation. And they were, I tell you, for the most part conservative. In fact, I can't think of a single left-wing member of the whole group. Some were maybe slightly liberal, but this was a conservative group, and I like what they said, and I like their vision of the world. And when they even spoke about my country, Britain, they were speaking truly. So as a person who is, living and learning in America, I trusted these guys because their account of the British royal family, their account of the Second World War, and their account of other things that happened in British and European history was correct. So then and not every American would know that because they hadn't lived in Europe or Britain. I had, and I knew these men could be trusted because their accounts were absolutely genuine. And so then I, dived into that information. I still do today. And you're quite right. It's as much a healing process of debugging now as it ever was in the past. I'm only conveying to my audience what I'm also, learning as of late, and trying to turn it around in real time through the media chances we have now with the internet, and make my study available to other people who maybe don't have the time and the patience to read the books.
Right, and it's a great contribution. I urge our listeners to also undergo a process, a journey of discovery and uncovering conventional stuff that we hear in the media. Realize that these things often are part of an agenda, and that you have to do the necessary due diligence and the work to go beneath it and begin the process of thinking for yourself. And that's not always an easy thing to do. Now, one of the things that interested me, Michael, in your research is that you really are tapping into some of the symbolic elements that we see before us as plain as day, that express some of the telltale signs of the occult, of of elements of secret societies. You're a musician, you're an artist, as am I, and you bring to it a certain understanding of the abstract culture, and looking at things that maybe others don't see, but that are being expressed. And I want you to talk a little bit about that and about some of the background and how these symbolic elements are used by, forces that are trying to subvert freedom and trying to impose in an informal way their particular point of view by undermining our individual sovereignty.
Oh yeah, it's one of the most important ways of cracking what's going on behind the scenes. Because remember, they closed the doors. We're not members of the club, so to speak.
Right.
And so, although I agree that this symbolism aspect is circumstantial, but circumstantial evidence has a huge kick when you bring it to court. So, although it's not conclusive of anything, you can follow it along and understand some very, very. It's like it gives you a classic keyhole, look. But that keyhole can be very valuable when you're in the complete dark, because the establishment elite has put us in the dark. And so people like us, look, even just count back a couple of hundred years ago, the whole human race was illiterate. So we're coming, reading and studying and being able to look behind the scenes is a very recent phenomenon. But I do believe, and it's worked for me, that one of the ways to do it is to study symbolism. For one reason, they use symbols amongst themselves. Whatever secret societies or cabals we're talking about, take the Shriners, they're the ones I think are somewhat, and again, it's a speculation, but I think they're involved with the Islam, the radical Islam. But take a group like that, or even another kind of Masonic, quasi-Masonic group, especially the Templars. These people use symbols amongst themselves. So then you have to say, well, wait a minute, if those symbols are being used amongst themselves and they think they're that important, then maybe we should find out about it. And then there's another dimension, is that they use it on us. And I mean that in the sense of a kind of a sorcery, on us, like a hex. Partly to communicate to us so that we sign on the dotted line in a kind of a right brain way. There's the left brain, the right way, and right brain, and symbols work with the right brain. So part of the complicity that they have over us, part of the mind control, is by using symbolic language to get us to sort of go along with the agenda, where, if we were fully conscious and rational of it, we probably wouldn't. So there's two levels to symbolism. One is that they love it themselves and use it themselves constantly for whatever in-house purpose they do. It's just like soccer, decals or whatever. I mean, symbols are all around us. We know a difference between a Target, and a McDonald's because of the symbols.
Sure.
So, and same with political parties. It's just something that comes out of the ancient world. But then I found this other more sinister dimension, which is that they start using symbols in a kind of a mantic, auto-hypnotic way. This has been accepted by many, many, many great people. And I started to get into it more from the occult side, because knowing that symbols are being used on a subliminally has been brought up by many people. Douglas Rushkoff, we've had Brown Wilson Key and Gene Kilborn. So this is accepted officially, but the occult side has not. So when all of this demonic symbolism is being used in, all the alcohol videos, and even many of the children, I mean, all of it, all that spews out of Madison Avenue is deeply evil, deeply satanic in my eyes. So you have to ask yourself a question: what on earth is all about? Why would they even want to do this? How does this help sell a product? But then that opens more doors, and you start to realize there's something even more pernicious than just selling a product. And once you've grasped that point, if selling a product would be bad enough with all of this horror. But when you realize it's about entrainment on a spiritual level, to bring people's spirit into the dirt, into the mud, into the sludge, of lower forces and lower energy, to sort of intrude into our direct natural connection with spirit, then you've really got to expose that pestilence.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. I want to talk about you mentioned the use of language and its code nature. This is something I studied a little bit in my book on the subversion of Judaism and how that was done by the Shabtai Zvi and the Frankist movement. I'll get into that in a minute. But in the modern parlance, there is, amongst the elites of the world, and certainly in the United States, we see this, it's almost like they communicate in a code language. There's double, triple, quadruple meanings to words. And it's a form of speak that was described by French scholar Elaine Benescon as totalitarian language, the language of power, where the speaker, the user of that language, who may not even be conscious of it, it's something that's internalized at an earlier point, usually in college, or they learn this. It's part of the culturation. But others are conscious. It's a language of indirection and of sophistry. It's a language of the use of words that have double meanings and indirect innuendo. Nothing is actually said. I think that a classic example of this right now would be former President Barack Obama. He would get up, he looked great, he spoke well, everything seemed brilliant. You walked away from it saying, wow, that was brilliant. But he didn't actually say anything that you could really hang your hat on. It was all this kind of like gobbledygook. It was like double talk. And it was vagaries that it was almost as if he was really speaking to two audiences. For public consumption, you and I, the bubbas out here, are supposed to hear this and look to him then as a great leader and as a great arbiter, someone who's, guiding our path and who's altruistic. But there's another language that's being used, a code language that goes out to people who are much more witting and much more conscious of what's going on. And I also think that one of the reasons that the establishment right now despises Donald Trump is because he doesn't do it. He doesn't do this kind of language. Now, he may be at times crude and he may be cruel, but he speaks plainly. He is honest. He speaks what he believes is true. And, the rage against him for that, because he's exposing this nature of this false kind of paradigm, is extremely intense. I mean, I just saw over the newspaper just before I started this interview that you've got the establishment media now, people at CBS, people like David Muir and these big announcers who come on with all the blue lights flashing behind them and all the hypnotic, use of media, that they're blaming Trump for this murderer in Florida because of his culture, because of the, when in fact, I mean, I've also seen some other stuff that comes to me that the guy was one of them. I mean, he was connected to the Antifa Black Lives Matter movement. He was an Islamist, all that stuff, which I don't know what the truth is. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but I'm only bringing it up to point out that their hatred for Trump and their hatred for this challenge to their establishment tease, their this cocoon they've created, is so intense that they're willing to blame him for everything.
Well, they're lauding Castro and lauding Che Guevara and new biographies and new PR and all sorts of high-priced documentaries and movies are being made. It's just absolutely not ridiculous. Oh yeah, I actually wrote right from the beginning that Obama was a kind of a pseudo Akhenaten, and the solar symbolism surrounded him can be right out of the 18th dynasty. You're quite right. There's been an active attempt to symbolize him as some sort of a messianic figure. And, a lot of symbolism. We could talk all day about the symbolism in that regard, but it definitely harkens back to Akhenaten, where his idiot wife was portrayed as some sort of Nefertiti. I mean, the thing is ridiculous, of course, but gee, I don't know. This is the way they work. This is Madison Avenue, and nobody gets to be president without, in some sense, succumbing to this thing. And it works. I mean, we're sitting here. He became president. It actually works. And so it is wonderful to see a more refreshing, normal person. I'm Irish, so Donald Trump doesn't rub me up the wrong way. I love his brazenness. I love his manner, and I love the way he can stand up and speak. And I think that's very needed right now, because one of the issues that we need as a solution is the courage and the guts to just stand up, look people in the eye, and speak like we used to do in the streets of New York. I don't know what happened. I'm a foreigner to America, and I grew up on film noir films, and I used to love the fact that people stood up, looked you in the eye, and said exactly what they needed to say. And now I get over to America, and it's nothing but PC. I just can't even understand the flip. The 180-degree turn, and it's diabolical to me. And then I want to look into why that happened. That doesn't happen overnight. There must be reasons behind it, And I think your work is seminal. I mean, I read hundreds of books a year, hundreds and hundreds, and I'm very rarely blown away. Your work, like you said earlier, about work that penetrates beneath the surface, maybe goes a little bit, into darker areas and connects some dots that other people are either too scared to link or just don't think are linked. You're one of the people who's linked some so important dots. I consider your work with some of the most important stuff of this millennium, actually, and that's why I'll do my bit to get it out. I really will.
Yeah, the check's in the mail, Michael. Thank you.
It's okay.
You're almost like interrupting my train of thought here. You mentioned the political correctness. That's just Marxist tyranny. That's an informal. That's totalitarianism. If there's one thing Trump's accomplished, is he's challenged that. That's an attempt to control every aspect of who we are. I mean, they want to control, like the Nazis did. They want to create a nanny state, a socialist state that controls as many aspects of the life of the citizen as possible. But this goes further. This is even worse in a way, because they're controlling not just our thoughts, but what we may think in the future. It projects, and they're putting us under a microscope. There was a professor at Harvard named Charles Pierce in the 1980s who actually developed this whole idea of microaggression, really radical Marxist guy. And the idea is that basically they're looking for a racist gene. They'll put you under a microscope. It literally means microaggression, to find something, and they only do it to people who don't genuflect to the left or who aren't politically correct at any given time. And that can at times mean liberals. So if you're liberal out there, you could be in the same crosshairs. If you do something that is a little bit off the reservation, all of a sudden the microscope comes out, the scientific jargon comes out, and science has been completely politicized, I'm sure, as you know. It's utterly a part of this kind of pseudo language. and you are destroyed. I mean, they can destroy a person's career, they can destroy their life by just simply pulling a little something, a little chestnut. They might have said, like in 1963, they were at a conference and they looked this way instead of that way, and all of a sudden, they ring it up the flagpole, and you're finished. They're saying, don't listen to this person because he's got something against black people, which is the main thing in the United States. That's our weakness here. Every nation, it's a little different. They examine the culture and they find the Achilles heel and they attack on that. And of course, it's the big lie, as Lenin originally said, and that Hitler echoed. The use of of a falsehood, and then the magnifying of that to the point where, by using their minions in the means of communication, you can barely overcome it. But I want to talk a little bit about the history of this in modern times. You've written about, and we've talked about, the influence of the Bavarian Illuminati, which was established on May 1st, 1776, and how that began to corrupt and subvert European nation states and Christianity. In Judaism, I wrote about this in my History of the War Against Judaism. It started with this false messiah who it was in 1666, who was by the name of Shabtai Zvi. And he had a huge following. We would call him a rock star today. I mean, he was like traveling around with this entourage, and it was like there was a lot of orgies and all that stuff going on. And he was touted as the Messiah. This was the next coming. And the way he proved his messiahship was he desecrated the Torah at the Bema and subverted the laws of the Torah. That was why, because he was the Messiah, he could do this. And he had a lot of following in Europe, including among a lot of legitimate, well-meaning people who believed him, until he finally made his way to Constantinople, and the Sultan brought him into his presence and said, look, you have two choices. Either you renounce your messiahship and I'll let you be a doorman, or you declare your messiahship, in which case I'm going to kill you right now. So he renounced his messiahship, needless to say. And, a lot of legitimate people then realized that the guy was a phony and they dropped out. But there was a lingering secret society that developed that continued to espouse his doctrines of subversion and of, overthrow. And even in Turkey and in the Islamic world, or particularly in Turkey, they call it the Donme sect. But in Europe, it was called the Sabbateans. And they gave birth in the 1700s to one of their main proponents, this guy Jacob Frank, who continued this process. I mean, of subverting Jewish values and subverting the Jewish faith, and moving toward a secular faith and moving toward like a world religion. He would change his religion. He would become Catholic, and then he'd go back to Judaism. He'd become Protestant. I mean, Shabtai Zvi became Islamic. Then he went back. And with the idea being that we're all one, this kind of, it was a pre-communist thing, that they would, create a one world religion, and that there was no such thing as objective moral values. Everything was whatever you wanted it to be. If you thought it was good, it was good. And this has really destroyed a large portion of Judaism. It really infiltrated it. And I see it in many of my Jewish co-religionists today. And I don't think they're conscious of it. But they don't believe in the Creator. They don't believe that the Torah is an immutable source of moral and ethical precepts, which the founding fathers of America believed. They don't believe it. For Christians, they don't believe in the divinity of Jesus anymore, who carried forth the precepts of the Torah for the world. And instead, they've replaced it with this kind of, I don't know what to call it, other than just this relativistic, amoral belief that man is supreme. And when you talk about the symbols of ancient times being used by these societies today to promote their beliefs, and you talk about Barack Obama as the great, glorious leader, this is exactly what the Lord God warned us about in the Torah when he talked about idol worship. This is not new. We think that that's over, but it's not over. It's here more than ever. The idea of the idol was that it was a false image, a false god, if you will, that was propped up by people behind it, imperfect people, who were pushing their agenda and who were putting the words into the mouth of the false god. I mean, that's what you have with a guy like Obama or any of these other people. They're kind of front men, they're idols that are put forth. I mean, here's an example of someone who was absolutely a nobody until all of a sudden he emerges like a phoenix out of nowhere and he's thrust into the presidency. And he was a tabula rasa. There was a blank slate there, which is usually the type they look for. And I think that describes what we're dealing with here. There's no sense of objective values. There's no sense that there's a divine source for truths and for morality. Everything is man-made for them. And thus they work toward the utopia.
Yeah, yeah. And he's a Mason, and he did appear out of nowhere. And the bizarre thing is that they seem to profess atheism on one level, but then they're Masons with another. So you're right; they change hats for different occasions. But the synagogue of Satan, should be known to all Jews. I mean, it should be right in there that they understand that the Sanhedrin crucified Jesus, that they were in collusion with the Romans, some of them. So this should not be new. It's only new to people who haven't studied their own history.
That's right.
These Sabbateans and people like that have corrupted Judaism. They got a few of the families on their side, not everyone. They had many exposers as well. But they were able to seduce some of the wealthiest families within Judaism. The Templars were able to seduce some of the richest families within Christianity to their side, And these dynastic rivalries and allegiances, they do happen. And I believe that some of these Sabbateans you're talking about, these Frankists, they're still around. We got Shriners, we've got some very crazy cults and sects that don't mean well. And then you start looking at the number of, not just presidents, but people at the head of the World Bank and, some of these federal orgs and some of these like sort of George Soros networks, you'll find that they're all going back to this hidden hand, of the Masonic secret society. So it doesn't indict normal Masons who are doing well and are charitable. I'm talking about some very high level people, and the information shows us that there is indeed a worldwide network of these people. And they're very adept, as you just said, of pretending that they're Christian. They put on a face, put on a hat for every occasion, because they're ecumenical. And then they want to come together and spread this allegiance that all you divided parties, all of your stupid little petty allegiances and beliefs, we need to bring that all together. Can't you see that we need to be one big global sludge culture and sludge religion? And we go for it because the media, through their Benetton advertisements and the Google, like you said, the talismanic terms that they're constantly using to seduce people. And they've been doing it drip feed, drip feed, drip feed since the 50s and 60s. And no matter how many insiders, come from the inside to warn the human race, for some reason the penny just doesn't drop, and all you got to do is just try to carry on as best you can.
Well, I think that they've done it in every generation since Adam and Eve. I mean, this is the darker side of human nature. It's the corruption of power. It's the hubris of human tendencies that believe that they can replace God in heaven with themselves. I mean, this was the warning in the Garden of Eden, that Eve was told by the serpent or Satan, you can be as God. You can know good and evil. You can know everything, the tree of knowledge. In other words, you can overthrow God in heaven and replace him with man. And that was the temptation then. It's the temptation now. And it's all about power. And most of the people involved in it are unwitting. They're unconscious. They just are sort of, I guess you might say they want to be one of the beautiful people. These are super powerful people who tend to dictate the culture and the cultural trends. And it's very easy to get swept up in it. It's very easy to conform to it. I think that a lot of people subjugate their own ideas, their own consciousness, their own beliefs at not an early age. I would say probably maybe high school and then college, definitely, in that they realize that in order to achieve what they want in the world, to get ahead, I mean, it really comes down to professional advancement. It comes down to personal advancement. You want to get the women, you want to get a good girlfriend, all of that. You have to kowtow to this dominant, secular, left-leaning establishment. And they thus block out of their minds ideas that might be in opposition to it, or they might, have a mild genuflection toward those ideals, maybe, but they become enslaved. I mean, I'm looking at your hat, unslaved. That's right. I mean, your mind becomes, you give up a piece of your own mind and your own soul to these ideas. And thus, you're sort of in a semi-comatose state, really, I suppose. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little. But I entirely agree with you, Michael, when you say that there are secret forces at foot. I think that there are. I think that they have secret societies in politics, in culture, and in religion, all three. I think that they are well financed by private merchant banking houses that are all over the world. Some people say that when you bring that up, you're being an anti-Semite, and some of the big names in that world are Jewish, at least by name. But I think that actually the banking establishment uses that as a deflection. They're saying, to criticize us means you got something against Jews. It doesn't matter if they're Jewish. I mean, it doesn't matter. Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they observe the Sabbath on a Saturday or a Sunday. That's not relevant. The point is that they are part of an elite group that really puts earthly power over all. They've manipulated wars, they've manipulated currencies, they've manipulated depressions and inflations. They have informally controlled your property, your income by putting a mortgage against your future. They manipulate you through the culture, through the media, through cultural institutions, through academia, all of it. And it has nothing to do. It's the furthest thing from either Judaism or Christianity. It's actually even not even Islamic. It's this radical, amorphous institution. Now, do I think that they all talk to each other in a smoke-filled room? I don't think so. Probably not. I think they think alike. They don't need to do that. It's just a trend that it's kind of an unspoken fraternity, I guess you might say. What say you?
They have their manifestos as well. They don't need to talk one to the other because, the Catechism of the Revolutionary, or they have their little sort of Masonic backstories, and it's an ideology, it's a demagoguery. And as you say, it's based in some of the lower aspects of human nature. So this is partly remote control, where you just cater to some of the lower appetites, and the need for people like my father who want to stamp their feet, to order people around, but to do it in the name of the people, and basically it's vanity, it's ego, it's massive egotism of an intellectual type, of some sort of members of the club, like all masonry is based in promise. Any hierarchy that's malignant is based in what you're going to get when you go up to the next tier and become one of us. And then the same rule applies all the way up. But that's in a college, that's in a university, that's in most corporations, the same rotten, meritocracy. But it's not a healthy meritocracy. It's like you said earlier on, it's about, you'll never be lonely as long as you side with our ideology. Then it's all going to work for you. Then you're going to be carried through the streets. How dare you ostracize yourself from this just because of some logic that you have, or some rationality? We're going to penalize you in every possible way. And unfortunately, you are right, it is getting worse. They're able to penalize you now, right from the courts. They get the psychiatric, my great hero, Wilhelm Reich, was locked up and basically died in a federal stockade, only for healing people. Well, there you are. And the list goes on and on.
That's right. Ezra Pound was another one. He was kept at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the last 30 years of his life.
Exactly. All he was trying to do was expose a few bankers and the duplicity of FDR, But see, there is a certain amount of not only parchment idolatry, but there's also this heroic thing. We talk about Obama as the most classic, obvious example. But it's also, they use that as well, because we love heroes. Heroes are great. But then they can put the pseudo hero in front of you as well. And unfortunately, a lot of people want to follow that and vote for that. They don't have to open their mouths and promise a couple of things like FDR's New Deal or Woodrow Wilson's United Nations or whatever it is. And people fall for it. And they wield out the same strategy again and again and again. And what they want to do is nucleate these nationalistic and racial differences, which are healthy and organic and natural. And there's no evil in them at all. But they want to make it look like it is. These Frankfurt School people have sat around and planned it out. They're very, very, very clever about the way they approach it. And they want to have duplicitous, money-grubbing, evil men, getting up. That's what a malignant hierarchy is. It filters out good people. That's what its job is, so that only the scum reaches the top, and then we wonder why our world is surrounded in these evil people. It's because there's an actual, meritocracy, a completely organized strategy to make sure that if you've got morals, and you're introspective and contemplative and spiritual, that's it. You won't even get past the university grade. They're already going to police you out because they're going to read those papers you're writing. And if you don't conform to that Fabian garbage, you're going to be marked down, and some other, straw person, but who can be on strings, a puppet on the strings, somebody they can order around, and they know. And then, of course, that's why we know there's this whole thing about pedophilia. Yeah, because they want people who have these peccadillos, so that it's the classic ops, black ops, where they film you or they have you on tape, and then you're in their power forever.
That's right. I mean, I think there's a little touch of blackmail behind anyone who rises to such a high level, and they know that something can come back and take them down if they get too independent. Either that, or they could be knocked off. I want to talk about, because you and I agree on the nature of the secret establishment. Listeners to this program, viewers may not. So whether you agree or not, the fact is that there are certain telltale signs philosophically. You talk very well about the actual symbolic signs that you can detect in everyday life through advertising, through the media, through movies. And it's a really fascinating subject. We should do a whole show on that. But I want to talk about some of the ideas and the memes, if you will, that are telltale signs of this. You made reference to your Marxist father, and I think of my own Marxist relatives and friends that I've known over the years. And there are certain mannerisms that are telltale signs of ideologies that are not healthy and that are not good for individual rights and the genuine growth of prosperity and all the things that we conventionally admire. And one of them is one that you just alluded to. And it comes from the Freudian concept of projection. In other words, what they are, they will project onto their opponents and try to say, and I think that many of them even do this unwittingly. And the projection that I want to bring up here is the idea of this incredible righteousness, this holier than thou attitude that permeates everything that they do and say. You can even see it on their faces and on their visible. I mean, a good example, we could mention hundreds of examples. I think of Hillary Clinton for some reason. This smirk, this kind of like ironed into her features, that of looking out at the rest of us. These people wake up in the morning and it's like they think they're on the top of Mount Sinai coming down to deliver the truth to everybody. The great gift of nature. It gets into this incredible self-righteousness. Now, they like to say that Christians are like that, but they're not. True believing Christians are people who question. Judaism is based on the idea of questioning, not having these hard-bound, ideas. It's a process of developing knowledge, and it's a humbling process. It's not this kind of incredible, blinding arrogance that they display, this absolute certainty when they speak. It's a style of viewing things that I think that most of us who are honest will notice that. Now, whether or not they're part of an Illuminati, okay, I get it. Most people don't want to think about that. Maybe they're not. But the fact is, we can see things that are visible to us in memes and in attitudes that they express, and they are not healthy. They're not good for them, but they're not certainly good for us and good for freedom. Would you talk a little bit on some of these characteristics that you've noticed?
Well, it's a form of psychopathy. Remember, the insider smile, the self-righteousness, it made me squirm. It's one of the things, because remember, I didn't have the intellectual ability when I grew up, listening to him every Saturday night with his pals, sitting around drinking themselves to death and talking about the rights of man while they go home and beat their wives and all the rest of it. So it was squirm. It was just a repulsion, right, that I had that just said, there's something seriously wrong with this, and I'm going to work out what it is. But you nailed it when you talked about the intellectual arrogance, because the most towering thing that I saw in him and all of his chums, these are little men. They're not giants like Ezra Pound and Solzhenitsyn and all. They're little men, and yet that it's just the demagoguery is basically the way to look at it. And you give a little man some power. Instead of one stripe, he's got three. Shit, he'll murder and he'll kill your enemies for you, and he'll wave your flag and he'll have that little red book and he'll profess Maoism. Half of his own brain doesn't even understand what it's all about. So the way that I work is to become more knowledgeable about their own subject than they are. And this involves the symbolism, because some of the people who use the symbolism, or let's say some of the people who are susceptible to it, aren't aware that they are. So when you point out on a dollar bill or the Masonic Temple in Washington D.C. or the great Senate halls, or these other Capitol buildings or whatever, when you show people this isn't just decorative, this is a language, then they have to believe the evidence of their own eyes. And believe me, that works way better than sitting down and browbeating them with a bunch of stuff from the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. That they checked out of that when they left school. They said, never again do I want to know anything. So you've got to have a different tack. So I turn to the TV shows. I turn to the documentaries and the media, not just what's on the content, but the way the content comes across. The medium is the message, right? And the way light is being used. Illuminati, you want to prove the Illuminati? It's easy. But it doesn't come in
look
words.
at the back of the dollar bill.
People think it's done. It's not done encyclopedically, it's done symbolically.
I mean, I did a program with somebody, I forget who it was, but we took out a dollar bill and we looked at the back and we looked at the seal, which was put on there in the 1930s, by the way, by Vice President Wallace. Henry Wallace was a avowed Marxist and who was an occultist who believed in this. He had like a guru, the Warwick, I think it was. Yeah. And that was the first time the American people actually saw that seal. And he went over with me all the different things on the dollar bill. And if you look at both the front and the back, and it was just an eye-opener. It's unbelievable, the amount of occult symbolism on that parchment. That, there were people involved that really were about this world order business. Now, I don't think that most of the founding fathers were. I think George Washington, there's a very famous letter from him to one of his constituents who was warning him about the infiltration by the Illuminati of his lodge in Alexandria, Virginia. And he said, yeah, I know this. I know it as a fact. And it's diabolical. So, I mean, you've always had in America people, I mean, maybe that's one of the things that have made us different. They've never taken over here. We've always had people who are witting enough, who are aware enough that they've exposed and they've opposed this agenda. Right now we have Trump. It's never something that has gained the absolute upper hand in the United States. And probably, look, I tend to be optimistic about this anyways, in that I don't believe that they do win as much as maybe we think they do, because what they're about, this idea of this amorphous world order controlled by an elite group of men, it's not natural, it's not normal, it's not in the interests of average people, it's not true. And so because of that, they lose, enough that they never really obtain their power. Now, in the process of their trying to get power, they may do some really ugly things like holocausts and depressions and world wars and other unspeakable atrocities. But ultimately, and in each generation, they do not win, and they are not winning. We just need to put them further on their heels by exposing them. It's that simple. It's our responsibility as citizens and as people, who are involved in public declamation, if you will, to expose them. Because the more we can do it, the further we can put them back. But they'll never go away. But we can continue to fight the good fight.
Yeah. We did a podcast last year called The Dying Conspiracy. It's something I did before, but then we really did a much more thorough job on it, where we analyzed not just the generational change that some of the old guard have died off. I mean, that's just a simple fact, isn't it? They were kind of old when they started the conspiracy. And so it's more of their descendants who are basically incompetent. So it backs up what you're saying. It doesn't mean that it's completely gone, but it's more, the conspiracy now is more thrashing around. The dinosaurs collapsed, but it's in its dying sort of phases. It doesn't mean that it still has not got any life in it. It certainly doesn't. We need to be careful. But it's not the same entity as it was when you're the bat crazy Lord Kitcheners and that type. The gung-ho ideologue is different today than the opportunist son of coke snorting, godless, hell-bound creature, that is trying to steer the great juggernaut today. He's making a mess of it. He's going all over the shop. But one thing I forgot to mention when I talked about the types you're speaking of, the ones who either buy into the ideology or purvey it through the streets, is that once you don't have a spiritual, heroic vision, you must put a Mao, you must put an Obama, you must put a Pol Pot in that place. So there is something about the psyche that if you don't have something higher than yourself, if you do not believe, you see, in a greater purpose, in the end, you start idealizing man, and it's just potluck. You're going to pick some demagogue, and you're going to start worshiping at his feet. And this is the projection you're talking about. You know, to the leader, to the alpha father. Please help me. I'm hopeless. You know, this dependency and all of the infantile stuff comes to bear. But it doesn't come to bear in the person who's put their faith, you see, and put their eyes are on a much higher sort of spiritual quest. That's a whole different relationship. And it doesn't deal with master-slave relationships, you know. But when you don't have that, then the master-slave automatically of itself becomes the dynamic in human affairs.
And I think what you're describing gets to why the establishment is so rapidly anti-faith. They do not want to have us believe in a God that is a creator of the universe and that is a lawgiver. And when you take away that God, I mean, G.K. Chesterton wrote about this very eloquently. He said that without God, you have nothing, and therefore you believe in everything. And once you remove the belief in an immutable source of morality that exists outside of human manipulation, then you can believe in anything. And that's where you end up with the idol worship, with the great figures. That's why we have school shootings right now. I know people don't want to talk about this, but the reason this has proliferated is because they took God out of the schools. I'm convinced of that. You know, I'm not saying I'm not trying to be simplistic here. There's a lot going on. But when you take God out of the schools, you take any mention of a belief in God as something that is seen as anathema and as unfashionable and inappropriate, and you can't do it, and you make fun of and denounce people who do in the most ugly way, then you're going to have people who tend to be all over the place. They don't have any moorings. That's when you end up with an idol, a Marxist leader like Hitler or Stalin, you know, who fill that need, because we do want to believe. It's natural for human beings to believe in something, you know, and if it's not going to be God, then who is it going to be? I would even say this to atheists. You know, the idea of a creator outside of human manipulation is what's made societies free, because you don't have to answer to the leader. You answer to a higher authority. Jesus is what he said to Pontius Pilate when he was asked, who are you king of? He says, I answer to an authority outside of you, a higher authority. And he was crucified within an hour of having said that. It was one of the first times that a human being, whether you believe Jesus was divine or not, let's put that aside, but he stood up to the most powerful secular force in the world, the Roman Empire, as one man saying, no, I don't answer to you. I answer to a higher authority. And that's what they hate, and that's what they despise. That's why they hate Christianity. That's why they hate faith in an immutable set of principles that they can't control and that they can't manipulate.
I think people can even prove what you said. Was there any school shootings before the 1970s? Before all of this liberalism came in?
No, there wasn't. Prayer in school was banned in 1963. So that was the beginning of it. Yeah. That there was no more reference to God. There was no more reference to prayer. You know, that's an interesting subject. I actually did a show on a book by an author who pointed out that it was brought by this atheist, Madeline Murray O'Hare. Her son now does interviews. He's become Christian, but it was also very unconstitutional in that it was the rights of the states to dictate things like prayer in school, not the federal government. So it played several roles for the establishment. It was a usurpation of power into the hands of a federal unelected bureau, namely the Supreme Court. And it also removed one of their biggest enemies, and that is belief in God, from children. So we have children now who are, they don't have any strong core sense of belief. And those children are now adults, and their children are the ones who are doing this.
Yeah. It's been a long tent-rising campaign. The media is hugely involved in it. That's why people have to open the symbolic literacy. That's, you know, as I said, it does dominate my work. And we start simply by just observing television, normal stuff that people are familiar with, and then slowly take it into more of an occult area. You know, on my female Illuminati site, I got 2 articles there that go into heavily duty the Masonic symbolism and how some of it hybridizes. See, it is Masonic, but they have a beautiful, they put Madison Avenue guys on it, and then they soften it, and it turns up on products. It turns up more in the ubiquitous media. But you can easily see that these suns and these pyramids and these other pentagrams and some of these other symbols, and it's important to know about them. A lot of people see symbols every day they don't think are actually Masonic or secret society symbolism. So I make sure that I try to put as many of the symbols there, then they understand what they are. And even some religious symbolism is misused, because remember, all of this evil is the misrepresentation of that which is sacred. So evil creates nothing of its own. It can't. Evil is uncreated. It can only bend out of shape that which has been created by spiritual people and spiritual forces. It takes it and it sort of misconstrues it. So a great deal of what we're looking at only has a lure for us. Our hands only move towards it because the spirit sees something spiritual in it, and that's the trap. So in order to break that, entrainment, in order to break it, to not be fooled by what they're doing, you have to really get into the symbolism aspect, because then you can take back those, you can understand the origin of these symbols, and you understand that they were basically spiritual in nature, and then they can't be used in this debauched way, to pull your energy down, to over-sexualize the children, and to just basically train the mind. It's just a situation of master and slave. But master and slave has no place in love. Love does not have slaves below or masters above. Love is freedom. And unfortunately, these simple precepts have been lost, in our modern world.
Well, they don't believe in love. They believe in unwinged eros. And you have, as you say, like the destruction of the innocence of children. In a moral society, we protect the innocence of our children. We make sure that they reach an age of maturity where they can understand these things. It's that's gone out the window. And I think that your work on symbolism is really, really fascinating, and something that I'm glad that you're writing books on it. It's an extraordinary subject, one that deserves a lot of amplification. I mean, we should all be kind of aware of this and aware of what we're looking at in the course of a day. Just walking around in our cities and looking at advertising and logos and all the rest. Now, Michael, you've done some work recently on what you've referred to as a corruption of the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I'm not Catholic, but I've always looked to the Catholic Church, like a lot of people do who are more conservative, as is somewhat of a beacon of morality. They have a standard. I want them to be who they are. I want the Catholics to be Catholic. I don't like this particular Pope because I don't think he's as Catholic as I want the Pope to be a Catholic, What's going on with them?
Well, you're right. And it's not really even the Catholic Church that I'm indicting. One has to use familiar terms. It's really the College of Cardinals. It's really a kind of a coterie. Remember we said earlier that these internationals and these Sabbatean sects have hidden behind all of the different masks of Christianity and Protestantism and Judaism and even Islam. Well, how can we leave out the Vatican? The Vatican the Vatican's not to be. The Vatican is a hive of secret societies, most of which people do not know about. A lot of it funded from Switzerland and from Belgium, for the black nobility, and particularly the Templars. Because when the Templars were accused of Satanism, right, and they were involved in some very dark stuff from the East. Then they didn't go away. It was all patched up later on because they finally got their man on the throne of the papacy, right, and there's been internal rivalries ever since. And so what we know as the Knights Templars are no longer a Western organization. This is an atavistic, quasi-Masonic group that is basically the prime mover. So people who go to my work on this will soon see that it's not. I'm not indicting anybody who's a believer in Jesus or anything like that, or the Bible or whatever. But again, I am pointing to what the Bible itself says about the false ones, right? About those speaking in my name, those hypocrites who do not let you go through the door, and they themselves cannot go through themselves, right?
Right. Well, now you say that
dead man's bones. That's the Knights Templar symbol right there, the skull and bones. So, and then you have the skull and bones, which is a quasi-Templar order coming in America, and the Templars have loads of groups, ostensibly Catholic on the surface, like Opus Dei and the Knights of St. Patrick and Knights of Columbus. And I'm worried about all of these groups. And again, the Shriners, who work with the Islamic, the radical Islam, there's some dark stuff there. But yeah, then to make it easy for people, I wrote an article that's on my site called The Red Papacy, which is about another turn that they went through, the same group. But in modern ages, they came up with this idea that since Jesus in the Bible does go around and heal the sick and is a man of the people, they started to re-script themselves as opposed to being, like the Catholicism you're talking about. Mm-hmm. They started to say, hey, we need to sort of communize ourselves. And there's a big, big movement there. And so the right-wing movement,
the liberation theology, right?
Yes, and they were purged. The right wing were kind of purged. I talk about the last pope who tried to hold it together. Pius XII, and he kind of failed in a way. And right. The papacy turned left, and through John Paul II, and then, well, of course, this happened in many stages we can't go into. But the most important stage, I think, for your listeners is simply that the first job through the 80s, leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is where your work comes in, because you're pointing out all the walls may fall. Communism doesn't mean it's dead. Right. That's the crux of the matter, right? But just for, again, headline purposes, the left, the shadow communists who are in the papacy, had to then go through systematic seducing all the world leaders in order to repaint, respray a picture of Catholicism, which kind of had a bad name. It's religious anyway, so a lot of these new, the new leaders who are atheistic and contemptuous of religion. So a seduction had to happen, and most of them toppled. Almost every one of the leaders toppled and started to cuzz it up and snuggle up to these the red papists, who they're not godly. They're not really. It's another one of these cults and sects hiding behind the veil of Catholicism. But that allowed them then, to have a pipeline into the highest echelons of politics. And I believe then that the United Nations and some of the other orgs are actually their creation. They're leviathans created by this shadowy red papacy. So I do write on that. But believe me, and I'll say again as a disclaimer, this is by no means to be taken by ordinary Catholics as some sort of a criticism of them and their beliefs. In fact, it's a fifth column, a Trojan horse that we have to be aware, that's working in the name of Catholicism, right? But has no such ultimate agenda. It's just another globalist mindset that is very, very powerful, but very sinister.
And it's also very difficult for any of us to really analyze these things because they're secret. We're talking about secret societies, and they're secret. So we can't know really a lot of it. We can get little hints from people who occasionally have a pang of conscience and then they turn on them and expose it, or there are other things we can do. But ultimately, we can't know. Now, you talked about the Knights Templar getting their man into the papacy. Who was that?
Well, it's happened several times, but the first one was back in Boniface. Oh, I don't. It's the Boniface II, maybe. I'll have to look that up.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. But they've had their men, and it was quite a wrangle. It wasn't easy. And see, all of these groups, Knights Hospitallers, Templars, whoever, they've all had their internecine rivalries, even within, Christianity. And the Templars were banned, by the bishops, right? And by Constantine and all of these people, not Constantine, but they fell foul of the papacy at a later, and King Philip of France.
They were the bankers of the Vatican, weren't they? They were the traders. They started with the Crusades, and then they worked their way into various trading in the Mediterranean.
Multimillionaires, multimillionaires. They were the first lenders of money, the first bankers, exactly, and also shippers, transporting spices and goods all over the world. But they also had a lot of ways of. They were not only able to get their men into the papacy, they got their men into the thrones of the world as well. And so there was already a corruption from that point on. But then there's that famous story about the Templar treasure, where did it go, and the suppression happened, and Jacques de Molay and all of that. So I get into all of that, to show you what, again, my theories is, when it comes to the papacy, I rely largely on the works of an insider, Averell Manhattan, who was one of the most amazing, journalists and writers, and a person who had contacts, as you quite rightly said. If you have the contacts within who leak information because they have a conscience, then you need somebody like the great Averell Manhattan, who then collates that. There's been others who've done this, both in an American context and the European context. So I draw largely on not just him, but Father Rivera, and Charles Chiniquy, other people who've written, great authors from within. I mean, Malachi Martin.
That's what I was trying to think of. Yeah, Malachi Martin. Yeah. And from my perspective, I think that the good people in the church still kept the upper hand right through the 1950s. I think there was a heyday of the church. It was the height of their moral influence, certainly in the United States, and the height of the influence of the priest. But I think starting in the 60s, things started to go downhill. There's a good book about this called A Few Good Men, that I interviewed the author. I forget the name at this point, but he talks about how the camel got the nose out of the tent in the American church, and how things started to go kind of haywire in the hierarchy, to the point where things got watered down. You had the pedophile scandal. You had the exposure of a lot of secret stuff going on there, and it's a huge problem. I hope that they right the ship of state in the Vatican, because it still, I think, has at least the infrastructure of a great moral force. One of the problems with the Vatican, and in a way you know this from secret societies, is that it is itself a secret society. It's a hierarchical pyramid structure, and that thus when you have something get into the works that's rotten and corrupt, it tends to worm its way in and corrupt the whole bunch. So, it's both a good structure, but it's also a dangerous structure for any organization to have that.
Well, we know it's not fighting back against Islamization. Right. It seems to be reined in and suddenly dead silent, yet it can open its mouth about such trivial matters. There's been popes now who even said that there's no such thing as a direct connection to God. All of these things are unnecessary. You've got bishops who don't even believe in God anymore. The thing has been definitely either infiltrated, that's one theory, or just of its own has got rotten for various reasons. This decadence and the influence of communism was really seriously, I call it a form of shadow communism. There was people from within in Italy, who really got, they were looking for both ways. They were ready to follow the more fascists, but then as your work has pointed out, that wouldn't have been a solution either. But they had also chance to turn, hard left. And they did, because they saw the younger generation at that time, this hippy-dippy Woodstock generation, not just in America, but all over the world. They went, if we want to convert and we want to have this group, aligned to us and believe it, we need to follow their lead. And so this idiotic move was made that in order to cater to this rabble, basically, this left-wing rabble who were, godless and just a Dionysian debauched, the Vatican followed them instead of being a bastion of truth. Said, we're not out soliciting anybody. They can come to us when they're damn well ready. And when the dark night of the soul comes to you and you're suffering enough, then you'll turn back to the light. We'll be there for you that day, mate. That was what the original. That's why the priest dress in black. The cure dresses in black. Right. Cure, because he'll cure you when and if the big questions of life and mortality and existential angst comes to you. They'll be there as one of the voices to say, let us remind you about your spiritual home. They don't run down after the street a bunch of communists and run after a bunch of lazy ass, hippies who are looking, smoking dope and just living a life of debauchery. You don't follow them and change your entire ethos to match their mentality.
They did, and I think starting in the 60s, they let in Maslow and Rogers, the psychologist, go into the seminary and start to teach about, sensitivity training and all this other crap. Anyways, Michael, we're reaching toward the end of the program, so I want to thank you very profusely for joining me. It's been a really interesting conversation. Would like to do more of it. I'd like you to take this opportunity to talk about where people can read your books, where they can view your podcast, Unslaved, where they can get more information about you, where they can reach you.
Oh, just unslaved.com would be best. That's where our podcast is. And I want you to be back in May, because here's a book that we're going to do a full, thorough.
Oh, yeah, I know that book. Excellent.
Yeah, by
really
this amazing insider telling you about Islam, not from the outside, but from the inside. But we're going to do a slideshow. And then after that's made, I'm going to send you the copy. And then I'd love to have you back on as a critic to say, what you thought of this presentation that we're doing on this book. So we'll stay in touch, because once I do this, I'll send it to you and get your feedback on it. We'd love to do a whole podcast on Amir Tahiri's incredible insights, because again, people use this little loophole to say, oh, sure, you guys, you're Christians, you're from the West, you're not inside Islam. It's a bunch of crap, everything you're talking about. Is that so?
Oh, no, that book is a classic. I have it as well. I'm glad you're doing it. That's great. That's really good news. And let's stay in touch. We could do some cross broadcasting and all of that good stuff. So again, Michael, I want to thank you for joining me. Michael Tsarion's my guest, and have a good afternoon, everybody. Take care.